Hello and welcome to another edition of the book review here at CCXP Exam Simulator. This is Michael Bartlett, and today I'm going to be reviewing Upstream, The Quest to Solve Problems Before They Happen by Dan Heath. So just a little bit about this book. It's I would say this is a book about complex systems interventions. So if you don't know what complex systems are, they're basically systems that are they're composed of lots of different interacting parts, let's just say that, and there's a whole body of work on them. There's a book called Brave New Work that was written recently, and if you think about a business and the way that it's organized and all of the subcomponents and all of the interacting components, a business is a complex system. So is a rainforest, so is a city, so is an economy. So that's what they mean by a complex system. Like I said, there's a whole body of work around this stuff, and what Dan Heath has done is, whilst he's mainly concerned with this book about looking at upstream effects, i.e. solving problems before they actually happen, he does it through the lens of complex systems, and he's produced this nice little chart here which kind of summarizes the overall framework in the book. But basically what it says is there are three initial barriers to overcome. So there's problem blindness, which is when you don't see a problem; lack of ownership, where someone says, yeah, that's not my job; and then tunneling, which is where people are just too busy, they're in adrenaline mode, they don't have a chance to step back, see the big picture, and then look at how they can actually stop problems from happening. And he says you've got to get past those things, and then you need to ask yourself 7 key questions. And these questions, as you can see, are: how do we get the right people? How do we change the system? How do we find a good leverage point? How do we find early warnings about the problem? How do we know if we're succeeding? How do we avoid doing harm? And then ultimately, who's going to pay for what doesn't happen? Because the ROI is a very tricky thing with anything that's upstream, because how do you show something that didn't occur? So without further ado, let's take a look at my top takeaways from this book. So the first important thing to know is, he says, we get stuck in cycles of reaction as it is more tangible. And so an example he gives in the book is, people crashing at intersections, for example. And a good one I will use is, often I see here in Missouri, we have these left turn green lights where it's yield to oncoming traffic. And it's very confusing, and they've started replacing them now with these left flashing arrows, and those are much more conducive to the way people think anyway. And I guarantee you, just by making that change, they've prevented a number of crashes. But the only way to know is to look at a long-term study of, say, maybe 6 months to a year, so that you can see the number of crashes that have happened coming down. And that's not always an easy thing to do when you're in the business world. People want to see immediate results, and so that's why doing things downstream is easier, because you can immediately see the number of things that happen with short-term measures. And so that's why people always end up getting caught in these what they call cycles of reaction, cycles of response, because they're more tangible. You can see them, whereas you can't really see something that didn't happen. He says every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. Systems are machines that determine probabilities, and to change the system you need to change the rules and the culture. So a great example he gives in the book, and he has his own term for it, I call it zip code privilege. But basically, depending on which zip code you live in, your odds of success dramatically change at different things. And it could be health, it could be graduating school, all those kind of different things. And so what he basically says in the book is, no one designed this with ill intent. A lot of these systems are all designed with the best of intentions, but then they ultimately produce results, and those results are consistent. There's consistent probabilities to things that happen in them. They can be very, very difficult to change, and so what you need to do is try and look at the rules that kind of govern those things and the culture. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the review later on, but you have to look for the right leverage points so that you can change them. But ultimately, if a system is doing something, it's ultimately because, whether with ill intent or not, it was ultimately designed that way. So he talks about problem blindness, which is when we don't see a problem, we can't solve it. However, once you can see the problem and immerse yourself in it, the leverage points become clearer. So a great example of this, and he gives in the book as well, is he talks about homelessness. How many people have a very strong opinion about homelessness, but probably have never actually been homeless themselves or interacted, in an in-depth way with somebody who is homeless? So what he's basically saying is you have to get in there and immerse yourself in the problem. One of the case studies that he talks about in the book is somebody did some analysis, and they found out one of the biggest problems, and therefore one of the biggest leverage points, was evictions. And if they can actually just pay a little bit more attention to negotiating and working with landlords on evictions, that immediately lowered the number of homelessness dramatic. So what he basically says is go upstream. What causes somebody to become homeless? Well, it's because they no longer have a home. Well, what causes that? And of course evictions were one of the major things that played into that. He talks about the accountability approach and how that can surface strands of causation. And so what he means by this is in any kind of system, there's a number of different players. People have different roles who are involved in a particular system with the goal of a particular outcome. And what he says is it's easy for people to blame each other, but one thing you can do to try and surface these strands of causation is to say, if I was in charge of this myself, if I was 100% accountable for everything that happened, what could I do? What could I have done better? All that kind of stuff. And so basically it forces people to think deeply about what we call their circle of influence and how they might be able to better strengthen that. And also by doing that, you also then start to surface areas that maybe other people could be helping with as well, but you hadn't even thought about those in the first place. So that's what I really liked about the accountability approach. He says when people's resources are scarce, every problem is a cause of stress. And this is when he talks about tunneling, which is one of the 3 issues. Tunneling leads you to put off important but not urgent tasks. This happens all the time. It doesn't just happen in business. It's happened in my personal life. I've been meaning to get, an additional life insurance policy, been meaning to write a will, things like that. And they're not critical. So they're very important, but I just never get around to them. And so recently, having read the book, I thought deeply about that. I thought, I better get on that. And he talks about implementing the upstream approach in your personal life as well as in the business world as well. But this is one of the main reasons why a lot of businesses struggle to even look at anything upstream, is because everyone's in this reactive cycle, everyone's in adrenaline mode. And the one way to deal with this, this is quite commonly known as well, is to put slack into your teams so people aren't running at 100%, and then that way they've got a bit of freer time to actually start looking at the big picture, start looking at preventative measures, and maybe trying to understand some of those different interactions in the system that could lead to little tweaks here and there making a big difference. He talks about something called the world avoided, and he says to start the path to the world avoided, surround the problem with a diverse group with a common aim, and utilize upstream meetings to look for risk signals and patterns in the data. So the world avoided is the world that we want to get to. It's a world where the crashes don't happen, that kind of thing. People aren't dying of diseases. It's whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve. It's a very specific problem in the system that you're looking at. Now, he says surround the problem with a diverse group. What this means is get as many people, get as many players involved that have all of the different roles that are involved with the system. Because typically when something hits the downstream, it's normally very specific. So, there's a murder and then the police are involved and that's it. But upstream, if we think about all the things that could have, led to that, school shooting is a really good example as well. You might want to be involved with the parents. You might want to be involved with local community groups, boys and girls clubs, that kind of thing. Anti-bullying. There's so many different areas that you can look at in the upstream side. And by getting all these people in, they all have a diverse lens, they all have different areas of experience, different knowledge, and that together, when you have these upstream meetings where you take time away from your downstream functional activities and you all sit there specifically together to try and figure out where are we right now with our intervention, how are things looking, brainstorming ideas, it allows people to unplug from the tunneling, if you will, and to specifically look at how that they can solve the problem best in the system. And that's where they can, look at data. Hopefully the data can show risk signals and it can show patterns, and then of course that's what you can use to ultimately build a hypothesis. There's another book, a really interesting book called Start at the End, and that's all about behavioral interventions as well, and I would recommend that as a complementary read with Upstream, because it has some very good ideas in there about brainstorming, different pilots and how you can test them, and do it cheaply as well without putting a ton of money into something. He says every problem has its own set of factors that increase risk or protect against it. Now, each of these is a potential leverage point. So when brainstorming potential leverage points, that's something you can just look at, is what are the factors that increase risk or protect against it. So that's a nice, clean, out-of-the-box takeaway that you can use. He said feedback in order to navigate is essential for success. So a lot of times people might say, well, being able to predict the future is the most important thing, but as he states, you cannot predict with 100% accuracy the future. Yes, you need to be able to predict a few things, but ultimately in a complex system, the feedback loops are absolutely essential. You need to have that information coming back so that you can see if what you're doing is actually moving the needle. And that kind of flows into the final point, which is short-term metrics are needed as part of a theory of change. So if you're not familiar with the concept of a strategy map, go Google that. A strategy map is essentially a theory of change. It basically says, if we do this, it will cause this. If we do this, it will cause this. Ideally, you would create a strategy map or a theory of change using some concrete data, but you can start with hypotheses as well. But ultimately, you should be able to derive your metrics from that kind of map, because then you're looking at things that are relevant, and if they're changing, then ultimately you should be changing the bigger needle, which is the goal and the aim of your intervention in the system. So he gives lots of really diverse and different examples in the book. One of them was people that are trying to fix sidewalks, and they used the wrong measurements, and so that they weren't ultimately helping everybody. They were only helping the people that complained the most, and the people that complained the most lived in certain areas, and the people that needed the help the most didn't complain because they didn't think it would get them anywhere. So they, from doing a deep dive and getting out there and talking to people, and as he says, surrounding the problem, they realized that mindset can be a big issue as well. Some people just feel automatically defeated. That leads me to another thought as well. He talks about schools and dropout rates, and something that came up was that when they looked at the data for this one particular school, it was the 9th grade that was critical, because it was a period of transition, and they said periods of transition are very, very key for people. If they go well, it kind of sets them up for success, but if it goes wrong, it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So just some really, really interesting takeaways in there. But I'm so glad that someone has written a book ultimately about systems interventions, because if you're a customer experience professional, you really need to read this book and understand complex systems and how to intervene in them, because ultimately that's what business is. And if you want to make business better and ultimately making the customer and the employee experience better, then you need to have an appreciation for complex systems, and you need to have an appreciation for how to fix them. And this book actually goes a decent way to coming up with a founding theory on how to do that. So highly recommended. Read it with Start at the End, and also another book called Brave New Work. I'll try and get that one reviewed in the next month as well. So I hope you enjoyed this. If there's any other books that you would like to see reviewed, just drop me an email at support@ccxpexamsimulator.com. I hope you're enjoying these book reviews, and I hope to be back with another one soon. See you later. Take care.